Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 6th of January, where we are getting closer to delivering our first speech. This is your last chance to contact me if you think you want to deliver your speech via Zoom. Thus far, I've heard from only one student, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a Zoom session if we've got just one student. But if we can gather some more, we'll do a live Zoom session. If not, what we will do is just post our speeches onto our Moodle site. And where we are is talking about delivering speeches, culture, and audience. And then what I wanted to do is to talk a little bit about some sample student speeches. That will be your today's attendance question, actually, asking you to view those sample student speeches and to talk about a strength and weakness for each speech. And then what we've got on Friday, our next class, is our first quiz. And that will be 20 questions, mostly short answers, some multiple choice and true false, based on textbook readings and what we've also discussed in class videos. And you'll have 24 hours to complete that particular quiz. That'll be your attendance question, so to speak. For the Friday, I will just ask you to return that quiz to me via email. Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And then I will evaluate the quiz and get that back to you. And I'm hopeful that the quiz will be more than just an exercise in showing that you've been watching the videos and keeping up with the readings, but that the questions will also help guide you as you are putting together your first speech, which, as you know, is a 5-minute autobiographical speech where you are telling the class a little bit about yourself. So we were talking about the construction of speeches last class. Today I wanted to talk about the delivery of speeches. This is where the acting component to the class comes in. It reminds me very much of when I teach my Shakespeare class that we talk about that there are two elements to Shakespeare. There's the reading element, the written element, but then there also is the performance element. And actually, talking about Shakespeare, if you haven't had a chance to register for the next semester, definitely you want to put that on your to-do list. And if you were interested in Shakespeare, it had originally been scheduled as an in-person class, but now it is scheduled as an online class. And I am teaching that course in case any of you are interested. And feel free to send me questions if you are interested. But in terms of the delivery or the acting component of speeches, what we are focusing on is something called the extemporaneous speech. So it's something that's prepared in advance, but it's delivered with a speaking outline. Very similar to what was discussed in the Toastmasters video, which is how we began the semester. And it's hard to believe, but today makes the month anniversary of our semester, since each class is the equivalent of a week. So Thursday, if you're watching this on Thursday, means that we are in week 4, or we would have completed the first month of the semester. So it is a whirlwind. But this extemporaneous speech is one that is not written and read, though there are situations where sometimes individuals will read a manuscript speech, whether they are reading from a document or they're reading from a teleprompter. And usually those are highly formal events where there's little or no room for error, something like a television broadcast, let's say, where you've got to get down to the second. And sometimes it's also expected in certain situations like presenting academic papers. But when you're doing something like that, you are sacrificing the ability to have a certain level of spontaneity. And in fact, I've never had the opportunity to deliver a speech with a teleprompter. The idea with using a teleprompter is that you can maintain eye contact. But as we will talk about soon, just because you are using a teleprompter, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are not going to experience technical difficulties. And in fact, you can see in the notes below under delivering speeches, Part 1, speeches. Under the manuscript section, I'm asking you to watch a teleprompter fail video. And it's only about 2 or 3 minutes long, and it's with Michael Bay, who happens to be a very famous director and movie producer, where we actually see his teleprompter fail and we watch him panic on stage, and basically he rushes off stage. And it's not that he didn't know the content of what he was talking about. He was talking about his own work, so obviously he knows the content quite well. But the anxiety of not having that crutch as he was expecting and having a live audience stare at him resulted in his panicking. So I always say, even if you do have a teleprompter, you want to be prepared for the unexpected. But definitely you won't have a teleprompter for this speech, nor will you be reading from a manuscript. What you are going to be doing is referring to your notes. Notes that will look very similar to the kinds of notes that I post beneath our videos. And actually, those are the notes that I myself use to jog my memory in terms of what it is that I'm going to be speaking with you. And keep in mind that the notes are basically for your purposes, even though I'm asking that you send me an email of those notes on the day in which you are presenting your speech, so that I can refer to the speech notes as well as the speech itself. And I'll give you some suggestions on ways that you might be able to improve your speaking notes. But in the real world, you wouldn't be sharing your speaking notes with anybody, which means that you don't even necessarily have to follow the guidelines of the speech notes, but they should be there. And if you aren't following your speaking notes, then you want to be careful that you don't stray so far that you lose your train of thought. Now, another kind of speech is an impromptu speech, which is given in the moment with no prior preparation. Usually it's unexpected, something like when you are receiving an award. And I encourage you to try to stay away from those sorts of speeches whenever possible. And if you are ever in a situation where you do have to give an unexpected speech, an impromptu speech right in the moment, rather than an extemporaneous speech, I suggest that what you do is you just keep it short and simple. Just say thank you, for instance, if you're being given an award, because the longer you speak, the greater the likelihood is that you will make some sort of an error because you weren't prepared for it. Now, I know that sometimes students are tempted to create memorized speeches. Usually that works well for something that's very short, and again, for a very highly formal event where there's little or no room for error. Take something like a toast at a wedding. But again, this isn't something that you would want to do in the context of this class. It's very difficult to deliver a memorized speech because oftentimes it sounds stilted. And also, what you don't want to do is to begin forgetting pieces inside of the or within the memorized speech, and then what you've got to do is backtrack and make it very obvious to the audience that you memorized it. So again, what you are focusing on is the extemporaneous speech, where it's prepared in advance and it's delivered with a speaking outline. And you want to think about, in terms of presentation, your voice. You want to be conversational, as we had talked a little bit about last class. You want to vary things like volume, speed, and inflections. So you wanted to try to have it sound like conversation rather than a monotone. And you want to enunciate. You want to eliminate mumbling. That is different from pronunciation, which is how you form words. And chances are that if your pronunciation is an issue, that's something that could take months, if not years, to improve. And unless you're really going to go into something like journalism or some sort of media, there really isn't any need to change your pronunciation unless your audience cannot understand what you're saying. And if it turns out that you're feeling a little self-conscious about your pronunciation, you can always begin a speech by saying that, let's say to the effect that English is not necessarily a first language, so your pronunciation might be somewhat different, but if anybody is having any difficulties with understanding you, to please let you know. And this is a great way of putting the responsibility on the audience rather than on you. And of course, if you are pre-recording your speech and posting it, one of the things you could do is to offer someone the opportunity of contacting you via email or comments or whatever the case may happen to be if they do have difficulty following your speech. Now, you know that what I'm going to be doing is asking you to post your speeches onto our Moodle site if you aren't delivering live via Zoom. And then what I'm going to be doing after all of the speeches are posted is asking each of you in the discussion forums to put a strength and weakness for each of those speeches. But what I'm going to do is ask you to send the strength and weakness to me, to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, to count for your attendance for that day. And then I will pull it all together and present that to you through the discussion forum or through the Moodle site, or a combination of the two. So, in terms of thinking about your voice, taking pauses can be very useful as well, especially for dramatic effect. Pauses can work very nicely as well for getting some oxygen into your lungs. And as we talked about, oxygen and breathing deeply is one of the important things you can do to help to alleviate anxiety nerves. The text also talks about proxemics, which sounds a little bit like proximity, which is about the use of space. And again, this is particularly important when you are delivering a speech live, in that you want to make sure that you're using your space efficiently and effectively. But even if you're being recorded, you want to make sure that you are being recorded in a way so that the audience can see your face and that there is sufficient lighting. The use of space can be very important. In fact, there are entire professions devoted to things like studies of proxemics, about how far or near or someone should stand to an audience member, or an arrangement of seats, let's say, in a classroom, which would be the best for optimal learning. There is also something called affect display, and that is your facial expression. And most audiences are going to be focused on your facial expression. If you're speaking live, if it's a small audience, obviously they're going to be able to see your face. If you have a very, very large audience, there's a good likelihood that you might have a screen that's projecting your face, much like in a let's say, musical concert. And certainly if you are uploading your speech because you've pre-recorded it, then the focus is going to be on your actual face. So one of the interesting things about facial expressions or affect display is that they tend to be pretty universal. That generally speaking, a smile denotes happiness, unless it's, let's say, a sarcastic smile. And pretty much a frown denotes unhappiness. I remember a psychological study where there was an investigation into individuals who were having great challenges with personal relationships. And I'm not talking about any of us. I'm talking about people who are having difficulty with functioning on a day-to-day basis because of the challenges they have with relationships. And what they found is that they were misidentifying facial cues, that individuals who had those sorts of challenges oftentimes identified a smile as something negative and a frown as something positive. It would make a lot of sense why they were having challenges with relationships if they were misreading body cues. And so much of our communication is nonverbal. Even think about the idea of physical space, and what is your comfort level between yourself and somebody else. And oftentimes that's determined by individual preference, but it can also be determined by culture, which we are going to be speaking about in the next few minutes. And if you've ever seen two people talking with one another with different comfort levels for personal space, what you might have seen is what I call the dance, where there's one individual who's uncomfortable because they feel that the other person that they're speaking to is too close, so they continue to step backwards. And of course, the person who is speaking is uncomfortable because they feel there's too much space between them and the other individual, so they continue to step forward. So basically what they're doing is dancing, in effect, as I call it, moving around the room, and both of them are uncomfortable and they don't know why. And it's simply a question of comfort level with physical space between the two of them. Gesturing can be very important too in relation to conveying meaning. You can have a conventional gesture. So this is a gesture that is given a meaning assigned by custom. So for instance, if you were to put a thumbs up, for instance, that usually means okay. It doesn't need to mean that. But this is something that our society or our culture by custom has given it that particular meaning. That's different than a descriptive gesture when you're trying to show the size and shape of something. For instance, it's about this long and it's about this high. That's much more universal. And then there are also indicators, something that can express feelings. So, for instance, slamming your fist on the table can express a feeling. So you want to think about the fact of how you are using your gesturing, what your affect display is, how you are using your space, and also eye contact. And ideally, you're varying that across your audience. What I suggest for individuals who are speaking live is that they might want to focus on the two corners of the room and the center of the room. And if they do that, they can give the appearance that they're scanning the audience. You can also find 2 or 3 friendly faces in the audience. Hopefully they're seated far apart from one another. And by looking at them and the top of their heads, it gives the appearance that you're scanning the entire audience. If you are filming, well, then you want to look into the eye of the camera. You want to think about the camera basically being your audience member, if you will. And eye contact is also determined by culture, any kind of group membership. And when we talk about culture, and now I'm transitioning into the 4th chapter here, or any group membership, usually we talk about things like gender or ethnicity or age, these very large cultural groups. But again, any group membership means that you've got, well, I don't know if 2 would count as a group, that might be a pair, but 3 or more individuals, basically. The idea is that they share behaviors, actions that are visible, and they share beliefs, things that they think are true and false, and they share attitudes, positive and negative feelings, and they also share values, which basically encompasses all of those things, actions and behaviors and beliefs and attitudes. Values are the hardest to change because they're so firmly embedded. But there's a predictive element to culture. The idea being that if you have some membership in a group, it's likely that individuals within that group share some commonalities. But you want to be careful to make sure that you are not stereotyping and assuming that everyone in the group is exactly the same. So groups can be based on things like geographic region, they can be based on hobby, they can be based on education or political affiliation or any of a number of things. So college students, for instance, that's a culture in and of itself where there are behaviors, values, attitudes, and beliefs that can be somewhat predictive. Again, we have to keep in mind that there is always individual variance. And we can refine that to talk about community college students. And we can refine that further to talk about Greenfield Community College students. I've had many of my students say that they've attended other community colleges, and GCC is different. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's better or it's worse. It's just different in terms of its values, its beliefs, its customs, and so forth. So things like what you want to consider when you are delivering a speech is who is in your audience, and specifically what cultural groups might be in your audience. You are going to have a multicultural audience, which means many cultures. We all belong to hundreds, if not thousands, of different cultures. And this gets to the idea of audience, which is chapter 5, and something called demographics. These are the observable characteristics of individuals. And again, we usually think about big cultural groups like age or gender or ethnic background or education. But again, it can be as small as, let's say, dog lovers or pug lovers, a culture to which I belong. I'm very much a pug lover. So you want to try to be aware as much as you can of the different cultural groups in your audience. Obviously, you're not going to be able to appeal to everyone, but at least if you've got some sort of general sense, and I've talked about this in the past, let's say you have a general sense of the age of your audience. If you've got mostly under the age of 18, then basically your speech is probably going to be very different than if you were speaking to a group of mostly adults. So the textbook, in terms of audience, talks about hostile audiences. And I doubt you'd ever be in that kind of situation. Usually individuals know full well that they're going into that particular situation. Take somebody from a political party who is giving a speech to the opposite political party. But you might have skeptical audiences, particularly when we get to the persuasive speech. So I wanted to talk about some suggestions on how to deal with that. There is no magic bullet, but doing things like establishing goodwill so that everybody is really clear that there is no ill intent. Establishing areas of agreement. So you might be not necessarily disagreeing about everything. So perhaps you can talk about what you agree about rather than what you disagree about. Using credible outside sources. Outside sources give you a sense of validity, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we start delivering things like our persuasive speech. Being professional. I've always said that what you really want to do is to earn your audience's respect. You don't necessarily want everybody in your audience to agree with you. So at least if you're professional and well prepared, they can at least acknowledge that you've delivered a good speech. Using humor, but again, humor is oftentimes culturally based, so we need to be careful that we're not offending anybody. And being as multi-sided as possible. Sometimes what individuals want is that they want their position to be acknowledged. They don't even necessarily want to be told that they're correct. And what I've oftentimes seen is that individuals will do what I call ignoring the elephant in the room, that they try so hard to present their position that they act as if no other positions exist. And this, again, we'll talk about when we get to the persuasive speech. Best to acknowledge that there are other positions. Certainly, you don't want to lose control of your speech and start talking about other positions, but at least acknowledging other positions and briefly indicating why those positions are not as strong as your particular position can be very helpful to getting a supportive audience. So as I indicated, I wanted you to watch 3 sample autobiographical student speeches. So these speeches were uploaded on YouTube, so I'm assuming that they are available for our consumption. These speakers are in no way, shape, or form affiliated with GCC, so you don't need to worry that one day you will be examined in a public speaking class of mine. These individuals, I'm assuming, were posting their speeches because it was a class requirement, but I don't necessarily know that. And they weren't necessarily following the guidelines that I'm giving you. So the, let's say, length of the speech, I've asked you to deliver 5-minute speech. We can't necessarily evaluate these speeches in terms of length. Some are over, some might be under, because we don't know what length requirements they were given. Things like evaluating a speech for volume might be tricky as well, because the assumption is that we can manipulate the volume so that we can hear it. Though again, if you're recording yourself, you want to make sure that you're recording yourself at an ample volume level so that we can manipulate the volume and successfully hear you. But we can talk about things like introductions, bodies, and conclusions. We can talk about things like use of evidence and detail. We can talk about things like delivery, vocal inflections, body language, eye contact, all those elements. So what I did was I just selected 3 speeches, and you can see these are in the notes below under section 4. And this is what the attendance question is going to be on our discussion forum by Friday, the 7th, and that'll be at 9 a.m., where you are being asked to list 1 strength and 1 weakness from each of the 3 sample autobiographical speeches that you are going to be viewing. And again, this is something that I'm going to ask you to do as well when you are watching the speeches of your peers, but I will have you send that information to me directly, and then I can compile that and make that available. But at this point, since we aren't talking about anybody within our class or anybody within GCC, we can do this in a more public way on our discussion forum. So our next class is on the 7th, Friday. This is where I will schedule quiz number 1. And I'm also going to ask you to contact me anytime between now and Monday so that we can schedule some sort of a practice session or some sort of a connection for speech number 1. And keep in mind that I had indicated that we could do that either via Zoom, via telephone, or via email, whatever is most convenient to you. So I just wanted to touch base with each of you about what you think your topic is going to be. Certainly, if you're ready to present a speech and get my feedback on it, you can do that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is that developed. We can just talk briefly about what your ideas are and whether you've got any questions or concerns, and that would satisfy that particular component. So I hope you're all doing well. I am doing well. Please watch those 3 sample speeches and put a strength and weakness for each in the discussion forum. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.